Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first I would like to point your attention that the previous night between the 12th and the 30th of July of 2025 was the first night when we haven't received any report about massive missile or drone strike over the entire territory of the Ukraine. So which means that the Russians took the Ukrainians small operational pause. Now let's discuss a very interesting article that was published by Zelensky and his social networks. He promised quick changes in defense leadership after meeting with Umerov. He is the current Minister of Defense. Ukraine needs positive dynamics in relations with the United States and new steps in defense management. The relevant decisions will be announced in the near future, Zelensky said. So according to some insights, the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, is going to dismiss Umerov, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. And this is very important, not just from the perspective that Ukrainians are going to change their leader of their defense ministry. The most important is that Umerov is a head of delegation in Istanbul in talks with the Russian Federation. So by dismissing of this person, Zelensky also is trying to cancel or to start once again or to relaunch any negotiation process with the Russian Federation. Another important statement was made by the minister by the Ukraine Intelligence Service. Russia's military grouping against Ukraine has grown to over 700,000 troops, according to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service. This marks an increase from May, when the figure stood at around 640,000. So according to these statements, the Russians increased the number of troops for another 60,000 soldiers since May of 2025. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the area of responsibilities of the group of forces north. We're going to talk about the Sumi direction and about the Kharkiv direction. The Russians reported that they managed to improve their positions already on the territory of the settlement of Ryzhovka. This article was published today by the group of forces north on their official Telegram channel, and they stated the following: fearless motorized rifle troops have driven out Ukrainian soldiers from their positions in the village of Ryzhovka, clearing 8 residential properties. So the Russians are saying that they began offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Ryzhovka. This is very important settlement for Ukrainians because Ukrainians used this settlement to attack this territory of the village of Totkin on the territory of the Russian Federation. So most likely the Russian forces will continue, and as we discussed during the previous videos, most likely and maybe the Russians will continue their offensive operation in this area until they establish complete control over the villages of Vorozhba and Belopolye, which are located on the main railway between the cities of Kiev and the city of Sumi. By this control, the Russians will probably deal significant damage to Ukrainian logistics in the city of Sumi itself. The Ukrainian forces continue their counter-offensive operation in the area of Kondratovka. This time, the Ukrainians tried to concentrate additional batch of units to the north of the settlement, but the Russians discovered the concentration of Ukrainian forces and began bombing and attacking them with FAB. You know that the most interesting and impressive is the Russia's accuracy. They bombed this territory, they attacked this true line, and they hit the targets without any problems. So Ukrainians continue counter-offensive, but we see that during the previous 48 hours, the Ukrainians haven't managed to improve their positions at all. This morning we got additional changes, additional statements about the situation in the village of Yunakivka. I would like to remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources reported that Ukrainians abandoned their positions in the territory of the settlement, but today the Ukrainian sources reported that this is not true, that Ukrainians still control the situation, and the southern part is under complete and strong control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Very interesting details are coming from the most eastern flank of the Sumi direction. We are talking about the area between the villages of Garnal and Miropolye. As you can see, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions. Furthermore, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, answered the village of Miropolye. As for now, we don't have any proof that can confirm this progress on the ground. The only thing we have is several mappers that adjusted their maps. So according to neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to to answer the village of Miropolye, and currently the Russians control around 5% of the village itself, and most likely the Russians will continue. If we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of June, we're gonna see that the Ukrainians use this foothold for some operations, and this is a very risky area because the Russians understand that Ukrainians can use this territory to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation. So that is why the Russians currently are tasked to cut this pocket and to maintain the lines between the settlements of Gaptarovka and the settlement of Garnal. So we are talking approximately about this line. So everything to the northeast of this red line, the Russians are tasked to take in the very near future. Now let's move to the Kharkiv area. We have very interesting updates. The Russians intensified their offensive operation in this direction. Today we got this video, very interesting video. This video was published by the 57th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. And in this video we can see lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking Russians, and this is probably the most interesting episode. In this video we can see how a Russian soldier was trying to cross the river of Volcha and he was attacked by a Ukrainian FPV drone. This episode was geolocated, and this is exactly the point where the Russian soldier was trying to cross the river. As for now, we haven't adjusted the map, but it seems that the situation that you can see right now in front of your screen doesn't correspond to the reality. We believe that the Russians do have foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river of Volcha and Donetsk, and maybe in the near future we will adjust the map in Russian favor in this area. Furthermore, another interesting statement was made by the group of forces north from, let's say, the most northeastern part of the Kharkiv Oblast, from the settlement by the name of Degtyarne. The Russians reported that the fearless assault troops have crossed the state border near the village of Degtyarne, Vovchansk district, dislodged the armored forces of Ukraine from the several strong points, and are consolidating their positions. So the Russians are saying that as a result of offensive operation, they managed to answer the settlement, and currently they are clearing this area. So most likely during the next several days, or maybe today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over this territory, and most likely this pocket would be colored in the Russian favor. So now we see that the Russians either opened another front line, or it's just another media attack to show that something is happening in the northeastern part of Kharkiv. I would like to remind you that probably the Russians are going to establish complete control over the territory in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv Oblast, with the purpose to restore control of the territories they lost during the Ukrainian Kharkiv counter-offensive operation of 2022. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation, trying to tighten the news around Ukraine positions in the southeastern pocket of Kliban-Bykska water reservoir. But the sources reported that during the previous days, the Ukrainians carried out successful counterattack that allowed them to restore control over the southern part of Alexandra Kalinova. If this information is correct, then the Ukrainians managed to restore not just control over the southern part of Alexandra Kalinova, but the Ukrainians managed to restore one of the most important supply arteria of 524 road between these pockets between Sherbinovka, Novospaska, Katerinovka, Kliban-Byk and the mainland. So now Ukrainians have possibilities to support their contingent and to carry out successful evacuation and rotation. So as for this counterattack, this information was provided by neutral mappers. So according to them, the Russians lost control over the southern part. Now let's compare the map between the dates for the better understanding of the situation. For example, this is the map by the end of the 12th of July of 2025. The Russians, according to geolocations we got in the past, controlled the southern part, and now we have reports that the Russians were forced to fall back from this area. Some of the territories were restored under complete Ukraine control. Some territories, especially Russian-controlled territories, were colored as a contested area. Now let's talk about the most important area, about the settlement of Nova Economishna. During the previous night we got very interesting changes on the ground, so let's discuss them in details, but before we start, let's compare the map between the dates. So first of all, let's take a look at the map by the end of the 12th of July of 2025, and this is approximately the situation. I would like to remind you that yesterday the pro-Ukrainian resources from Deep State adjusted their maps, showing additional progress of the armored forces of the Russian Federation in the direction of the settlement of Fyodorovka and in the direction of the settlement by the name of Boykovka. Both territories, according to Deep State, were colored as a contested area. But later we got additional report that was published by pro-Russian resources, and according to pro-Russian resources, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to break through not just in the direction of the settlement of Fyodorovka and Boykovka. The Russians managed to improve their positions significantly into the north and to the northwest of the settlement of Economishna. So this information was provided by very reliable pro-Russian resources, and according to them, the Russians first managed to secure this stronghold. This most likely took place during the previous week, and then the Russians continue advancing further until they get this former mine. The Russians secured these territories as well. Then the Russians crossed the river of Markova and entered, let's say, the northwestern part of Economishna. And from this foothold, the Russians continue advancing further in the southern direction until they get this river and these constructions. And according to pro-Russian resources, this territory is already under complete Russian control. This is a complete disaster if this information is correct, because the Ukrainians were using this area for supplying and supporting their forces further in the northern direction. Now the Russians control this logistic road. Furthermore, the Russians managed to answer or to attack Ukrainians from behind. Now the Russians are able to advance from this area in many directions, especially in the northwestern part of the settlement of Economishna. They can enter the territory and to establish complete control over this part of the settlement, which will allow the Russians to create a very strong foothold. Furthermore, for the Russians from these positions along the anti-tank ditches can continue offensive operation in the southeastern direction and to attack this mine, the most important stronghold in the area of the city of Economishna. Who controls this stronghold control the situation, and obviously this is a primary target for the Russians. They want to take under control this territory, and if they do this, this will allow the Russians to continue their major offensive operation in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Belitska and towards the village by the name of Rodinska. If the Russians control these two settlements, the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration would be caught in cauldron. So we are waiting for additional details from this area. Obviously, this report published by very reliable pro-Russian resources is fantastic. We are waiting for additional clarifications, and of course, we are waiting for the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. But one thing we can say for sure, that the situation remains tense for the Ukrainians in this area, and it seems that they're losing the battle for the settlement of Economishna. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Dnipropetrovsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received lots of changes, just small adjustments of the map in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Mirna. During the previous night, we got lots of, let's say, confirmations from different sources that the Russians managed to improve their positions, and very small adjustments. But when talking about important videos, we have this one, and in this video we can see how the Russians destroyed another bridge in the area of Velika Mikhailovka. I would like to remind you that since the beginning of July or since the beginning of June, the Russians destroyed at least 3 bridges in this area. Let's increase the numbers of updates for better understanding. For example, the bridge of Velika Mikhailovka, the bridge that was destroyed during the previous 24 hours. Another bridge was destroyed in the area of Andreeva-Klivtsovska. In this video, we can see the consequences of Russian attack, and we can see how exactly the Russians were bombing the bridge. The bridge was destroyed, and another bridge was destroyed in the area of the village of Ivanovka, and this episode took place on the 7th of July. So as you can see, the Russians are trying to destroy Ukrainian logistics completely and to cut Ukrainian contingent on the Russian side of this area of the border between regions from complete supply and support from the mainland. And we see that the Russians are pretty successful with this. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the area of Kaminska, where the Russians secured the village of Kaminska completely, at least according to different sources. I would like to remind you that just yesterday we colored the southern part of Plavny based on the video that was published by the pro-Ukrainian resources. Here we could see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians exactly in this point, and today additional changes on the ground were recorded by different sources. The Russians, as you can see, secured the village of Kaminska, and maybe today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information, and at the same time the Russians secured completely the southern part, and this battle for the central part is ongoing. Now the Russians, due to the fact that the village of Kaminska is secured, will continue offensive operation along the village of Plavny until they get the settlement by the name of Stepnogorsk. So the Russians are going to continue their offensive, and I would like to remind you that several days ago, the commander-in-chief of the armed force of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov, came to the area of responsibilities of the group of forces Dnieper, and most likely the Dnieper offensive is going to be a major offensive also of the summer of 2025. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes on my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.